And there we are. Now, for those who are just tuning in, they may not realize this, but because they wouldn't realize this, but we had already started and forgot to make it live. So we're going to do a little bit of repetition here for those who are just tuning in to let you know exactly what panentheism is. I got to get to my screen share PowerPoint and get that set up. There it is. Okay. Now, we're going to do some quick definitions. I don't know how quick they'll be, but we're going to try to do some definitions here. The first one is from Dr. Geisler's book, Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. Panentheism is not to be confused with pantheism. Panentheism literally means all. Pan is God. Theism. But panentheism means all in God. It is also called process theology, since it views God as a changing being. Bipolar theism, since it believes God has two poles. Organism, since it views all that actually is as a gigantic organism. And neoclassical theism, because it believes God is finite and temporal, in contrast to classical theism. Then we have cat in my way. And we have a chart here that will help people understand the differences. Theism, God is the creator. In panentheism, God is director. In creation is ex nihilo in theism. Creation is ex materia. Ex materia means the material already pre-existed, is eternal, pre-existing material. For most panentheists, God simply organized it and began creation when he said, "Let there be light." God is sovereign over the world in theism. God is working with the world in panentheism. God is independent of the world in theism. God is dependent on the world in panentheism. God is unchanging in theism. God is changing in panentheism. God is absolutely perfect in theism. God is growing more perfect in panentheism. God is monopolar in theism. He is bipolar in panentheism. By being bipolar, that is not an emotional statement. That is, he has two poles. Is the physicality, which is the creation, and who he is in essence. God is actually infinite in theism, and he is actually finite in panentheism. We also have from Doug Powell in his really fine little book, Holman, Quick Source Guide to Christian Apologetics, because our souls are our essence, which in turn is part of the ultimate reality, we are all a part of God, though we are not God. And because the world is ever changing, God is also ever changing. Our souls learn and grow. God becomes more powerful. God then uses that power to create new things for us to learn. God is learning and growing just as we are. Is Richard Rohr a panentheist? Marcia would, of course, say yes, and I would say yes, but let's look at his own writings. This is from his blog article, The Christification of the Universe, where he says, God is not just saving people, God is saving all of creation. It is all real presence. That's a sort of Roman Catholic concept where the bread and wine become the actual physical flesh and physical blood of Christ. In this case, God, the universe is God's physical body. We could call it the primordial Christification or anointing of the universe at creation. This is not pantheism, God is everything, but panentheism, God is in everything. And one more quote from his blog article, This Is My Body. Christ is the eternal amalgam of matter and spirit as one. They hold and reveal one another. Wherever the human and divine coexist, we have the Christ. Wherever the material and the spiritual coincide, we have the Christ. That includes the material world, the natural world, the animal world, including humans, and moves all the way to the elemental world. Okay, what is the problem, Ms. Montenegro?
Well, yes, I certainly have a lot to say on this. This is an area I have been reading about and researching for several years because, I was coming across it actually in the emergence first. Rob Bell did one of his Numa videos was called Everything is Spiritual. And when I watched that, it's not real clear that there's anything wrong with what he's saying. But I was thinking, no, everything isn't spiritual. That's not true. The material world is not spiritual. It's not, it doesn't have spirit in it, And so I was thinking, I wonder if he has this panentheistic view. Well, turns out he does. That came out later in some of his later books. And so I was really looking into this because you also find this in the New Age. You find both pantheism and panentheism in the New Age. You find panentheism in a lot of different belief systems. But I think it's a lot harder to identify. Pantheism is much easier to identify. So panentheism is trickier and, in my opinion, more deceptive because it is harder to identify. And when people express something about God being part of the universe or in the universe, it can sound maybe just like a poetic statement. And a lot of times I think people can read something that's expressing panentheism and they don't identify it.
And they don't pick it up because we have the view that God is present everywhere.
Yes, he's omnipresent. Yes.
And many don't seem to realize the distinction between being present everywhere and being present in everything.
Right.
So
exactly, that's a good point. Yes.
Right.
Omnipresence, yes, is God is everywhere because God cannot be contained anywhere. So God is present, but he's distinct. I think distinct is a really good word. He's distinct from his creation. And also there are views that cross over into panentheism that don't seem like they would be panentheism. For example, if you read or hear somebody say, God had to create, that was part of God's nature, like why did God create the world? Well, he had to create. It's part of his nature. When you say that, that's panentheism because it's making God dependent on the act of creation. In other words, God wouldn't be who he is unless he created. So he's immediately limited by the idea that he must create and that he didn't have a choice. So even the idea, and I've actually seen people say that because I think they think it sounds good. Well, God had to create because God is love, so he had to create. That was expression of his love. Well, maybe it was an expression of his love, but he didn't have to create. So it's very, very tricky.
Right.
There's a lot of different shades of panentheism.
Exactly. In theism, if God never created anything, he still would be completely complete in himself.
Right, exactly. Yes, God doesn't need an extension.
Right.
But if he had to create, then essentially there's a connection between God and creation that makes him somewhat dependent. In other words, who he is has to include the fact that he created. And that is panentheism. Whenever there's some kind of connection like that. So it can be very subtle. I also found panentheism in the writings, hope it's okay to bring it up, and Vocamp. And I actually have a whole section, my article on her book, 10,000 Gifts. I have a whole section on panentheism because I kept coming across this language. At first, I, gave her the benefit of the doubt and assumed it was poetic. But she kept on and it became more clearly not just a poetic thing. It seemed to be part of her theology now. And also, she kept saying, I'm not a pantheist. So she was aware that she was using some language that was unusual, but she kept saying, well, I'm not a pantheist. Well, yeah, no, she's not a pantheist, but whether she's a panentheist or not officially, whether she acknowledges it or not, she was expressing it in that book. So you can come across it really anywhere, even in Christian material. And when I was looking for a book, a really good book on panentheism, almost all the books I found, the Christian books, when I was looking for a Christian book, all the Christian books I found were books supporting it, except for one. I finally found one, which I recommend. John W., I think is his middle initial, John W. Cooper has a book, Panentheism, the other philosophy, the other, oh my gosh, I've got it right over here. Anyway, it's Panentheism by John Cooper. The other something of the philosophers. And he starts from Plato. He goes way back to the ancient Greeks. He goes through history chronologically and discusses different people. Now, some of these people, he says there's debate. There is still debate, academic debate on whether these people were pantheists or panentheists, because a lot of times these people would express both views, and who knew what they really believed. And so he would give his view why he thought they were a panentheist. But it's a very detailed book. But if you really want to get a scholarly Christian viewpoint, and at the end he gives a refutation of it and why he does not agree with it, that's the book to get.
Well, okay, so I want to cut this part just a little short because we want to talk about the ramifications of that, and that would be this: when I at one time, I haven't done it in a while, when I would go to an area, let's say Cortez, Colorado, and I would teach all of the high schoolers preparing for college on worldviews, something all churches ought to do pretty regularly, but they don't. And I would point out that every book you read, every song you listen to, every film you watch has a worldview being conveyed, even if it's fantasy.
Yeah.
And so you want to understand worldviews, and you can be entertained, but you need to ask critical questions even as you're being entertained. Otherwise, you embrace worldviews that are not Christian without realizing it. And then we watch a film. The one I like to use is Hidalgo, which has 3 worldviews in it. And their assignment is to pick out what the worldviews are, which one is deemed as the best and truest worldview by the filmmaker, which is the most honorable, and which is the least honorable and suspect. And they're all shocked as they watch the film, because it's a very good story, at what comes out of it. Now, I'm not going to tip off the answers to that. I think the viewers should watch it. But that really plays into what we're talking about here. There's an underlying worldview being conveyed that is not a Christian worldview. It is panentheism, which then leads you to some other issues that come into play, like the Christification of the cosmos.
Right.
Or the creation is the Christ.
We have a viewer here. Hello,
R. Hickman.
Mr. or Ms. Hickman. Yeah, I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but from South Alabama, says, I had an uncle who taught that God didn't create ex nihilo, or out of nothing, but created out of himself. This is a view promoted in the books Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh, and also in some other material that is mostly New Age. So God creates out of himself. And of course, when you think about it, it's not really, it's logical that God would somehow create out of himself, because how does an infinite being create, out of himself, some kind of finite? Of course, they may believe the universe is infinite, but this is a common view, and you will hear that in the New Age. And of course, there's no basis for it, but it's a view that fits in with this panentheism, because then, like Richard Rohr said, that God's presence is it's actually not distinct from creation. It's part of creation. And like Rob Bell said, everything is spiritual. So then you have God's somehow in the creation. And see, for some people, they think that sounds very nice, because then you can say, well, nature is sacred, nature is pure. And of course, this is a New Age view. This nature is sacred and divine. That's a very New Age idea.
Well, sure. And as I pointed out early, in the beginning, some of the American Indian religions hold a similar view
Yes.
of panentheism and in association with animism, the idea that the creation is communicating with us. It comes in the form of animals and trees, and you see it in Disney films like Pocahontas, where she goes to get the wisdom of Mother Willow and that sort of thing.
Right, spirits. Everything has a spirit. Yeah.
Everything has a spirit, right? So it's kind of everywhere, and you need to be aware of it because you're learning worldviews. So if the creation is the Christ, which he says, he also tells us in his writings, and we deal with this in the book, that the book Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret, that Jesus became the Christ not at the incarnation, but at the resurrection.
Yes, well, it's more that the universal Christ was able to go into creation at the resurrection. The universal Christ was embodied in Jesus. And then the resurrection allowed the universal Christ to enter creation. And at that point, Jesus and the universal Christ are distinct. They're not one and the same. And so the universal Christ is in creation and at the same time is pulling creation on this evolutionary path towards a point of perfection. And creation includes everything. It includes people. It includes, the trees. I think I've heard Richard Rohr say it even includes man-made objects. I think he said that on Oprah. I would need to double check. But, that to me doesn't make any sense, but he could have said that. So this universal Christ is pulling everything to a point of perfection and is yet also part of creation, because Richard Rohr teaches that the first incarnation of Christ was creation. That's one of his main teachings.
So just to start kind of moving toward a recap, because we could spend literally hours just on this one topic.
Yeah, really.
Where we started with this, and we're toying with whether we do another one or not. If people want to send us in questions we can respond to, we'd be more than happy to set this up and do more. But this is our ninth edition in the series. What we've demonstrated is, number one, the Enneagram is an invention of a Russian mystic. Number two, it was added on to by occultists and New Agers. Number three, Richard Rohr got a hold of it and he added theology to it that is heretical theology. It is clearly not Christian.
Right.
Either his panentheism or his perennialism. Neither one are Christian.
Right.
Number four, he conveyed that to his disciples, Suzanne Stabile,
Chris Hurwitz,
and others. There's a sort of a little deception following that then went into the church. And he passed it on to Rob Bell, probably Brian McLaren, and other progressives that you can see in some of their talks and teachings and books these very ideas. When Brian McLaren says, I don't try to reach a Hindu or a Muslim for Christ. I just want them to be the best Hindu or Muslim that they can be. Because there's really no difference between being a Buddhist, a Hindu, or a Christian. They're all going to coalesce at the same place,
right,
which is in Christ, right? So,
right. Yeah, and Rob Bell admits he was influenced by Richard Rohr for several years. I think he said that back in 2011. So
right.
He had already been under his influence. I would think maybe since maybe 03 or 04, probably before he wrote Velvet Elvis.
Probably. I know that Aaron Nyquist, who was the worship leader at Willow Creek, married Bill Hybels' daughter, also was and continues to be very enamored with Richard Rohr.
Yes, and he admitted that publicly in a sermon.
Yeah. And now, right now in a sermon, when he started at Willow Creek on his personal page, he let them know that Richard Rohr had revolutionized his view of Christianity. And so you start seeing the influence of Richard Rohr into Willow Creek and through the churches that they are connected to, which to me kind of sets up how is it that the Enneagram became so widely embraced so quickly in just 3 years. This is a multi-million-dollar 15-book industry going through they were really ready for it, prepared for it early on.
Yes, some ground had already been plowed earlier. And so it just, and other channels too, like the contemplative spirituality was a channel for the Enneagram as well, from a lot of spiritual directors who embrace the Enneagram and teach it. So there were a lot of ways it came in. And this panentheism is very much an integral part of Richard Rohr's theology. You can't really agree with his theology unless you agree with the panentheism, because his viewpoint wouldn't make sense without it. It's part of what holds his viewpoint together. And so is the perennialism. It's all kind of, and I think perennialism, and I think I said this in our last program when we talked about the perennial philosophy. From what I can tell, the perennial philosophy includes panentheism, because everything I saw written from people who have that view, they talk about the presence, meaning God, or the divine reality, as part of creation. It's not distinct from creation. It's part of creation. And that's panentheism. And it makes a lot of sense in the perennial view that they would accept panentheism, because it would make it would make the perennial view seem more logical to them. If they're going to embrace that, then panentheism is just kind of comes along with it. So that's another way it's getting in, because perennialism is sort of sneaking in too. So this panentheism, which, as you said, was not historically at all ever a part of the church and was not accepted as an Orthodox view, is sneaking in. And a lot of reason is because people don't know what it is and don't recognize it.
Right. Well, if you want to get more information, I'm going to tell you to go to enneagramsecret.com. At that page, enneagramsecret.com, the book is there. Marcia has, we have a video Marcia did that's about 9.5 minutes. It gives you an overview of the Enneagram, its origins and how it got here. We have the endorsements of the book are listed there. And we have a section in the bottom which has a link to all 9 of these episodes inside the Enneagram Secret. There is a link to audio interviews that we have had, and a link to currently three about hour-long webcasts, 2 of them from the Unknown Webcast and 1 of them from our friend John Haller, who did an amazing job of dealing with the Enneagram and talking about the book.
Yeah. And give that website again, in case people didn't catch it.
Enneagramsecret.com.
Okay.
Enneagramsecret.com. Easy to find if you can spell Enneagram. Enneagram. Enneagram.com. Enneagramsecret.com. That'll get you right there. So, all right, Marcia, we are going to do our little, let me close this here.
And Mr. or Ms. Hickman here confirmed what I said. That's exactly what my uncle taught.
Yep.
He once said in a church to a congregation, "You're sitting on Jesus." It makes me wonder if this guy was a pastor. That's kind of scary.
Yeah, it is kind of scary. So, all right. With that, we're going to do a little screen share, and Marcia, you can say goodbye.
Okay, goodbye. Thanks for watching.
And if you have questions, send them in to us, and we will do a follow-up.
Yes.